start with a question, and I'm going to duck to see your answers. Are there any criminals in the room? Okay, you're all lying. Has anyone in the room committed a crime? Thank you. You're in good company. I'm a criminal too. I've been committing crimes my entire life. At the age of 10, my best friend and I stole a Bic lighter, a bottle of butane, and nearly burned an elementary school to the ground. At the age of 14, I sold drugs to impress a boy. And at the age of 16, I shoplifted. I stole a book and a New Age CD. These are some of my favorite stories to tell. But they're my favorite stories to tell because the statute of limitations is up, I think, except on arson. And also because I wasn't caught. We don't use the word criminal to talk about ourselves when we've done something wrong. We reserve that word for people who've been caught. And those are the people I want to talk about tonight. In Oregon, we call inmates adults in custody. That's the official term. And it's a lovely term, and it's sensitive and maybe even progressive. But outside of the Department of Corrections, when we are with our friends and family and loved ones, we're a lot more likely to use words like convict, delinquent, deviant, murderer, rapist, arsonist, drug dealer, or thief. When I was hired to work in a college program in 3 of Oregon's prisons, the man who would become my boss said, "Don't Google your students. You don't want to know." Except that I have a background in journalism and an insatiable curiosity, and I had never taught in a prison before, and so fear also took over. So I said, thank you for the advice, thank you for the job. I left his office, I went home, and I sat in front of my computer, and I waited for my roster. And I waited, and I waited, and when it came, I Googled. I Googled mugshots, face sheets, rap sheets, appeals, affidavits. I read victim statements. I discovered a website called Love a Prisoner, which was not very impressive. Okay. And the stories that Google told me were heinous. To call any of my students criminals would not be an exaggeration. Most of us think that the vast majority of people in prison are in for petty crimes, or this is something that's being talked about a lot today, that we have too many people in prison for petty crimes, drug, theft, property crimes. I do not disagree with that at all. However, the students that I teach are largely in for violent crimes, incredibly violent crimes. These stories, the stories that Google told me, didn't pan out in the classroom. My first night at the Oregon State Correctional Institution, I was surprised to find that the class looked a lot like the other classes I teach in. Tidy rows of desks, students sitting in tidy rows of desks, a dry erase board, markers. The student said, "Thank you for coming." They said it that night, and they said it every night. And every night, they said, "Drive safely," when I left. I didn't forget all of what I had read on Google, but it wasn't part of the interaction, or at least I can't point to a time where I felt that it was part of our interaction in the classroom. But the stories that the students told me, the students that were at the center of my experience at the Oregon State Correctional Institution, were that these men are fathers, brothers, cousins, uncles, sons, grandsons. They are best friends. They have best friends. They're lovers of nature, of Pikes Peak, of the high desert, of the Alsea Bay. They love Iron Maiden, a lot of them, which is great because I teach poetry in prison, and Iron Maiden's lyrics are quite poetic. They love cowboys, cow tipping, fast cars. And over time, they learned to love Adrienne Rich, Margaret Atwood, Langston Hughes, Raymond Carver, and Basho, who wrote, "The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers." I want to repeat that very tiny poem because I think it perfectly reflects what time must be like for a person who is incarcerated. The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. When we incarcerate a person, it's dehumanizing, but it doesn't make them less human. And I think in some cases, it makes us less human. A lot of us think of education as a process by which we gain skills, knowledge, information. When education is done well, it engages the imagination. One thing the students I see in prison need more than anything is the ability to imagine themselves when they get out. And I've told you that 99.9% of the guys I teach in prison are in for violent crimes, and all of them are getting out. They need to be able to imagine what their lives can, will, should look like when they re-enter society. Imagination is at the core of problem solving. So we have a problem to talk about. There are 2.3 million men and women in prison in America. 95% will get out. 5% will leave prison in a coffin. 95% of 2.3 million adults in custody will be released. They'll be our neighbors, our colleagues, our coworkers, maybe our in-laws. They'll take their children to the same schools that we take our children to. 67% of those who are released will reoffend within 3 years. They may or may not go back to prison. 76% will reoffend within 5 years. Without the application of imagination, this is useless data. And so is this. Providing an inmate or an adult in custody with an education reduces the likelihood that they will return to prison by 43%. The program that I work in has a recidivism or repeat offense rate in the single digits, and the highest number I've seen is 6%. And I only know of one person who has reoffended. We need to reimagine for ourselves what our communities will look like when 95% of 2.3 million people locked up are released back into them. We need to reimagine what the function of our correctional institutions is, why we call them correctional institutions in the first place, what it is that we ought to be correcting, why we call them penitentiaries, and who it is who should feel penitent, why we call them reformatories. I don't think we call them that very often any longer. We also need to reimagine and redefine justice so that justice looks a little bit more like mercy and hope and less like vengeance. I want to end with a poem that was sent to me by a former professor of my own, also witness to many of my crimes. It was also a favorite poem of some of the men that I've taught in prison. So it's called Making Peace. I'm just going to read a few lines from it. It's a long poem. Making Peace by Denise Levertov. A voice from the dark called out, "The poets must give us imagination of peace, to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war, but peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making. Grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid. A feeling towards it, dimly sensing a rhythm, is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. Thank you.